Welcome back to Odyssey Academy, and we're moving on to lesson number 9, which is tweaking for improvement. Now, by now, hopefully, you are solving your long-term problem. Maybe you've already solved it. You already have all your elements in place. You have your style figured out. You have your skit written. You have costumes created. Who knows, right? Who knows where you are in the process? But what you want to do in lesson 9 here is take a step back and see if there's room for improvement in that solution and all the components that create your solution. So that's the spirit of lesson 9. And to do that, here's our agenda for today. We're going to ask, does your solution actually solve the problem? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Is there any room for improvement? We're going to revisit our definition of creativity. Is there any fluff or confusion that we might be able to remove? And we'll introduce this idea of keeping it simple, silly. We'll talk about what's called the curse of knowledge. I'll explain what that is in a second. And then we'll talk about this difference between being creative with something completely foreign and unfamiliar or something that is familiar with a slight twist, and whether or not one is better or different than the other. So let's go ahead and get started with the very first question is, does the solution you've created actually solve the problem? Now, remember, a few lessons ago, we talked about this idea of looking big picture, focusing on the details, and then taking a step back and looking at the big picture. We want to do this process several times throughout our journey, right? Throughout our Odyssey. And this is one of those moments, right? We want to take a step back and ask yourself, with the solution you've created, does it actually do what the long-term problem is asking you to do? Now, remember, in the long-term problem, Part A, the problem, specifies what you have to do to solve the problem, right? It talks about the creative emphases, so those components that are scored for creativity, and it also talks about the spirit of the problem, what teams are expected to do. Every team is expected to do is to follow the spirit, the essence of the problem. So you want to take a step back there. If you haven't looked at that long-term problem in a while, go back and reread it from top to bottom and give particular attention to section A and make sure that whatever you've created completely fits in with what the problem is asking you to do, right? So that's one place we want to look. The other thing we want to look at is section B in limitations. Remember, there are certain requirements and rules we have to follow when we're solving our long-term problem. So go back through and make sure, read each and every single line item and the requirements under each and ask yourself, given our team solution, did we actually meet these objectives and have we paid attention to the requirements within limitations? If the answer is yes, great, you can feel pretty good about yourself. If the answer is no, you got to think, oh, what do we need to do to make sure we actually address that particular requirement or limitation? So if you're able to do that, right? So look at the problem, look at the limitations, make sure that you've included all those elements, then you can feel pretty good that your solution is on the right track, right? So that's important. The second thing here is when we think about room for improvement, don't forget, OM is a creative problem-solving organization, right? So we're looking at divergent thinking, all types of possible solutions to one problem. But we're also thinking about creativity. And we said creativity is about originality and effectiveness. So if we put on our lenses, make these little glasses, you put on these glasses and look at every part of your solution, right? Your backdrops, props, costumes, your characters, your skit, your songs, your vehicles, your structures. Are they original? And are they effective, right? And we can go through each and every single component that you've created for your solution and say, could it be more original? Is there a way to make it more original? Is there a way to make this more effective, to get its job done better, right? If you ask that about all the components of your long-term solution, with particular emphasis on those things listed under creative emphases in the problem, again, you're gonna be solving the problem even better with a higher level of creativity. All right, so the next thing you want to ask yourself is there any fluff or confusion or confusing parts to remove? And we're going to introduce this idea of keeping it simple, silly. So keep in mind, you only have 8 minutes to present your solution. It's not a lot of time. It goes by very quickly, right? So you have to know what you're being scored on in the long-term problem to make sure that everything you need to convey in those 8 minutes is getting attention. And not only that, but remember we talked about the rubric evaluation approach. If something is worth more points and something is worth very few points, then allocating your time, that limited 8 minutes, to the things that get more points is probably better than giving a lot of time to something that doesn't get a lot of points, right? So you have to really think about your solution insofar as it relates to those scoring elements and make sure that if there's any extra stuff, just fluff, that's not getting scored in any way, then maybe you don't need it, right? So it's kind of like writing a paper and editing it down. Sometimes we get carried away. We add a bit too much detail. We have our sentences wrong, a bit too long. Sometimes we need to edit that content down. And the same thing is true for your solution, right? We want to make sure is you're really delivering as much of that solution to your judges and the audience in that 8 minutes as possible without distracting them with other stuff that's irrelevant and doesn't get scored, right? The other question to ask yourself is, what does your solution look like if you omit that extra fluff, right? Does it change things very much? The hope is you can get rid of that fluff and still have a really strong, in fact, maybe even a stronger solution, because all those distractions are now taken away from it, right? And the only thing that's being delivered is exactly what you want the judges to hear. All right, so that relates to the next point, which is editing it down to include only what's needed, what's only asked for in the problem, and also what's scored in the problem. The last point here is something we often say in any world that we're in, which is keep it simple, silly. A lot of times we as human beings like to overcomplicate things. That doesn't mean you can't build a really intricate technical device for a score, like that's fine, but your overall solution, if you add so much complication that it's really hard for the judges and the audience to follow, then even the cool things like a technical device will get lost because they just can't wrap their head around what it is you're doing, right? So just think about what are the scored elements, what is necessary, include all of those things, make them as creative as possible, and then anything extra that is unnecessary that's not getting scored, if you can get rid of it without affecting your solution or get rid of it and make your solution even better and more focused, even better, right? So just think about that as you're editing and reviewing your solution. So another concept I want to introduce you to is what's called the curse of knowledge. What is the curse of knowledge? Well, it's basically this. It's something that people who are experts in different topics face all the time. If you're an expert, you know what you're talking about very, very well. And the curse of knowledge is this assumption that other people know just as much as you do about that same topic, right? So I teach marketing, I'm a marketing professor. I know a lot about marketing and how it works. The curse of knowledge would be if I assume that other people I'm talking to who are doctors or teachers or whatever also know the same amount of marketing information that I do. It's just not possible, right? Because that's my area of focus. If I were talking to a medical doctor about his or her profession, I don't know as much about medical science as they do, right? That's what they've studied. So again, if they assume that I can talk at the same level and the same language as they do because they're medical doctors, there might be a bit of disconnect because I just don't have that knowledge, right? That's not my training. So the curse of knowledge is knowing something so well and kind of assuming that the rest of the world also knows what you're talking about, right? In Odyssey of the Mind, in the OM context, you have spent so much time with your long-term solution, right? That's why we call it a long-term solution. So you know your solution up, down, inside out, sideways, every which way. You know it, right? You know all the costumes, you know all the lines, even other people's dialogue. You know the backdrops, you know how things change, you know how your technical device works, you know how much structure, how much weight your structure usually holds. You know all that, right? But the judges in the audience are seeing this all for the first time. And they only have 8 minutes to understand your solution, right? They don't have months. They don't have all the weeks you spent preparing that final solution. All they know is that whatever they're seeing is what you're presenting to them, right? In those 8 minutes. So the idea here is that it's a super complex program. There's a lot of requirements, a lot of moving pieces. You can't assume that the judges in the audience are going to know and follow along with what you're doing if you try to throw so much at them in those 8 minutes, or like things just aren't organized. There's a lot of extra stuff that doesn't make sense and doesn't need to be there. It's going to be very hard for the judges in the audience to follow and to understand. So just be thinking about your audience coming from a marketing perspective, a professor. Think about your audience. What are their needs? What is their ability to understand your solution in the 8 minutes that you have to deliver your solution? And just try to make sure that your solution can deliver in a very clear, concise way what you're trying to deliver in your solution. All right, so another thing I want to point out here is oftentimes because you're rehearsing and you're practicing your solution time and time again, you might get to a point with your skit, for example, where you think a joke that was so funny the very first time you wrote it is no longer funny, right? Maybe you think that your backdrop, which you're just certain was creative because you spent so much time making it original and effective, is no longer creative weeks after using the backdrop. So this is another problem with curse of knowledge, is that you take for granted, right, how funny those jokes are. You take for granted how creative that backdrop is because it's so familiar to you, right? You've been living with this backdrop for weeks or months. You've been living with these jokes for weeks or months. The first time you hear a joke, it's funny. The 50th time you hear a joke, it's not as funny anymore, right? But here's the thing. The day of competition, the judges and the audience will be seeing that backdrop for the first time. they'll be hearing that joke for the first time. So that doesn't mean that you can't improve your backdrop, you can't improve the comedy of your scene. That's fine, that's up to you. But just keep in mind that some things that might seem a little less creative or maybe not as funny down the road to you will still be super funny to people that are hearing it for the first time or seeing your creativity for the first time. So keep that in mind. Beware the curse of knowledge. And just keep in mind that your audience and your judges just don't know as much as you do because they're not as intimately familiar with your solution as you are because you've been spending weeks and months practicing it. All right, the last concept I want to convey in this lesson is this notion of being completely foreign or having a familiar concept with a twist. So a lot of times in OM, teams want to be super original, right? We talked about this idea of being super novel and super innovative and thinking of something way, way, way outside of the box of what people would normally think of. And that's great. We want you to be creative, right? Now, there is a bit of a risk that you run from being so creative that it makes it really difficult for the judges and the audience to kind of understand where you're coming from. And why would that be the case? Well, the more original and out there you get, the less familiar something is to the audience and to your judges, which means they have to do a bit of learning. They have to understand what it is you're putting out there. And if it's not super familiar, it takes more mental effort for them to understand what that is, right? So there's an alternative option to here, which is basically starting with something that people are familiar with, a story or an idea, a concept with which people are familiar, and then taking that familiar thing, whatever it is, and giving a creative twist to it, right? Now, what benefit does this approach have? Well, the benefit is that you get everyone on the same page in terms of familiarity. Like, oh yeah, I know what that is. And then you can give them that creative twist or creative surprise, which is good because they followed along and then they saw how you changed it. If you start with the other option, with the completely foreign original thing that people haven't seen before, even if you make it creative or have some sort of creative component to it, the audience and the judges might still be trying to wrap their head around what it is in the first place because it's so unfamiliar, it's so out of context, it's so irrelevant, right? And this presents that trade-off between originality and effectiveness. If something is so original and out there that it doesn't really have the right context for the task at hand, it doesn't seem relevant for what you're doing. Remember, tasks, the context and relevancy is part of effectiveness. Then suddenly there's this weird tension where like it's super original, but it's not very effective, right? If instead we start with something familiar, right? So it's familiar, therefore it's effective, it's contextual, it's relevant, but we give it a new innovative twist, that's the originality piece. Now we're elevating both originality and effectiveness, which is creativity. I'll give you an example based on my own experience in OM. So years ago, we were tasked with recreating a Shakespearean story during a different time period, right? So my team thought we'd be very creative and do a lesser known, but still sort of known Shakespearean story called The Taming of the Shrew, instead of Romeo and Juliet, because we figured everyone knows Romeo and Juliet, but that's not very original. So we took Taming of the Shrew, and we wanted to put it in a completely different time period that people just wouldn't think of Taming of the Shrew as fitting in, right? So Taming of the Shrew is about two sisters, one that does not want to date, like she's just over the whole dating thing, and the other one who like wants to, but has to wait because her sister's older. It's a comedy, right? So Kiss Me Kate is based off of it. 10 Things I Hate About You, the movie, is based off Taming of the Shrew. So that's the idea of the story. So it's like this funny comedy between sisters and the whole romance, like The Bachelor, Bachelorette kind of thing. So that's Taming of the Shrew, not as well known as Romeo and Juliet. You know Romeo and Juliet. They fall in love, they're from families that hate each other, and they can't be in love, and they die at the end. It's sad. Great. Okay, so those are the two stories. We chose Taming of the Shrew because we felt it was lesser known and therefore more original and more creative, and we decided to put it during the Salem witch trials, which is like completely unrelated and irrelevant to the Taming of the Shrew, right? There's no witches in Taming of the Shrew, like none of that matters, none of that makes sense, right? So I will tell you that we went to our regional competition, and there was another school that chose to do Macbeth. Macbeth has witches in it, if you can recall, also during, guess what? The Salem witch trials. Now, we were offended because we thought, a play about that includes witches set during the Salem witch trials, like, come on, how original, right? But it turned out that people were familiar with those witches from Macbeth, and so there was some sort of familiarity with the witches of Macbeth in that story, more so than the Taming of the Shrew, plus this idea of witches during the Salem witch trials, so there was this continuity there, and they beat us. What? We were just so devastated. So we came in second place, they came in first place, and we thought, you know what, we need to up our game a little bit. We need to change our solution between regionals and state, which is totally allowed. So we decided to go back to the drawing board, and we said, you know what, maybe we shouldn't take this completely foreign original approach of Taming of the Shrew and the Salem witch trials. Maybe what we want to do is take something that is familiar to most people and give it a really unique creative twist. So what we decided to do was take the most like well-known story of all the Shakespearean plays, which is Romeo and Juliet, right? Remember, a couple minutes ago, I said we never wanted to do that because it's like, how unoriginal, Romeo and Juliet, everybody knows that, right? But what we decided to do was to take Romeo and Juliet and set it during the Scopes monkey trial on evolution, right? So back in the day in Tennessee, there was a court case on teaching evolution in schools. People were against it. It created the play Inherit the Wind. But the idea we had was how nice that the judge, where the judge sits in the judge's bench, and the witness bench right here, where they are called to testify, kind of creates a balcony, right? So like if Juliet were up here and Romeo were down here. So we set Romeo and Juliet during the Scopes monkey trials on evolution, and we made it a whole theme about evolution and like competing factions of creationists and evolutionists, and that became the warring houses. So again, we were able to take something extremely familiar to everyone. Everyone in the room would know what Romeo and Juliet is, but take Romeo and Juliet and give it a really big twist to make it about evolution of all things, set during a very controversial trial in history, the Scopes monkey trial, right? Turns out we went to state, we won, we beat the team that did the Macbeth Macbeth Salem witch trials theme, and we got to go to world finals with our new solution. So I present this to you, not saying you have to do this, but just keep in mind that sometimes taking something familiar that the audience and the judges can kind of rally behind and understand very quickly, and then giving it that 180 twist comes across as more effective and more creative than just kind of dreaming out like way, 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 way out there, where it takes a long time for the audience and judges to even wrap their head around it. Because by the time those 8 minutes are over, maybe they didn't even have time to connect with the idea you were trying to present, right? And that presents this greater conversation about the tension between being original and being effective. We want to do both, right? We don't want to do one at the expense of the other, because that actually doesn't make things more creative, doesn't raise the ship for everybody, right? So that is the last concept that I wanted to teach you in this lesson. Progress report very quickly. Do you, one, think your solution actually solves the problem, right? So looking at your solution, the ideas you have, what you've come up with, does it actually solve the long-term problem as outlined in your problem section A, and then also limitations in B? And then question 2, do you think there's any room for improvement for scoring? So looking at section D of your long-term problem, seeing the scoring, looking at your solution, do you feel like whatever you've come up with is really getting all the points that are listed in that scoring section? If not, what can you do to tweak it and improve it to get more points? And then question number 3, do you think, or it says, think there is any fluff confusion that you can remove? In this case, the letter G and replacing with a K. See, I did it on purpose. But the idea there for your solution is there anything that's not being scored that might be confusing, that maybe is too much, that if you took it away would actually help your judges and your audience understand your solution better and actually make your solution clearer and even more creative, right? So just have a look, think through your solution and ask yourself, is there anything we can do to improve this? Is there anything we can do to clean this up a little bit? Because it'll probably serve you better in the long run. So good luck with that as you review your solution, and I'll see you next time.